For years, Sister Wives fans watched the Brown family from the outside. They watched the marriages, they watched the arguments, they watched the moves from one state to another. They watched Kody Brown build a family around the idea that plural marriage could work, but there was always one thing viewers could never completely see. What was it actually like to grow up inside that family? Now, one of Kody and Christine Brown's daughters is opening that door. And this time, Mykelti Brown Padron isn't simply talking about what happened on television. She's talking about what happened before the cameras could explain the story for her. In recent interviews, Mykelti has discussed her childhood, her relationships with the different Brown mothers, the way children were treated in the family, and deeply painful experiences from her past. And after one particularly serious disclosure, Mykelti said she felt that she was suddenly under a microscope with TLC. That statement alone raises a huge question. Why would Mykelti feel that way now? Was she finally saying things the family had spent years avoiding? Was she revealing too much about what happened behind the scenes? Or is this simply Mykelti taking control of her own story after spending much of her childhood being filmed and edited for television?
He makes money.
Because one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Mykelti is no longer willing to let the television version of her childhood be the only version fans hear. And what she has been saying is forcing viewers to reconsider some of the Brown family's most familiar stories. When Sister Wives first premiered, Mykelti was just a teenager. Viewers saw an energetic, outspoken young woman growing up in a massive family. She was one of Kody Brown and Christine Brown's children, surrounded by siblings and multiple mothers. To viewers, the Brown household could sometimes look chaotic, but also strangely organized. There were rules, there were responsibilities, there were older children helping younger children, and there were multiple adults supposedly sharing the responsibility of raising everyone. But Mykelti's recent reflections suggest that having many adults around did not necessarily mean every child's emotional needs were automatically met. In one recent interview, Mykelti described Christine as the mother she was closest to. But when asked which other mother she would have gone to if Christine wasn't available, Mykelti gave a surprising answer: Janelle. She described Janelle as someone who put the kids first and approached problems in a practical way. That may sound like a small detail, but it tells us something important. Mykelti remembers each mother differently. Christine wasn't simply mom. Janelle wasn't simply another wife. Meri wasn't simply Kody's first wife. Robyn wasn't simply the newest wife. To Mykelti, each adult occupied a completely different emotional position, and those differences mattered. One of the most striking parts of Mykelti's recent discussion wasn't about one specific argument. It was about something much bigger, whether the children actually had their needs met. When asked whether having so many mothers meant that the children always had someone available to take care of them, Mykelti pushed back strongly. She said she did not believe all of the children's needs were met. In fact, she described the opposite. According to Mykelti's account, many of the children were left wanting more, and if a child didn't bring an issue directly to their biological mother, that problem might effectively disappear from the adult's attention. Think about what that means. The Brown family structure was built around the idea that several adults could collectively raise many children. But Mykelti's experience suggests that sometimes the very size of the family could create a different problem. Who was actually responsible when a child needed something? If one mother thought another mother was handling it, and another mother assumed the biological mother knew, and the child didn't speak up, then who noticed? Who asked questions? Who followed up? And most importantly, who protected the child when something went wrong? That is where Mykelti's story becomes much darker. One of the most controversial things Mykelti has discussed involves the family's attitude toward tattling. This is where her story becomes particularly difficult. According to Mykelti's recent account, there was a strong expectation among the children that they shouldn't be tattling on one another. On the surface, that might sound like a normal household rule. Parents everywhere tell children not to constantly report every little thing their siblings do. But Mykelti has explained why she believes that kind of rule could become dangerous when children were dealing with something much more serious than ordinary sibling conflict. And this is connected to the most painful revelation she recently shared publicly. Mykelti disclosed that she experienced a serious childhood incident involving sexual abuse by another child. That is an allegation based on Mykelti's own recollection and should be treated as her account, not as an independently adjudicated fact. But the emotional impact of her story is undeniable because Mykelti wasn't simply describing something terrible that happened. She was describing what happened after she tried to communicate about it. And according to her account, the response she received made her feel as though speaking up itself had become part of the problem. That is why the tattling discussion has become such a major part of the conversation surrounding her interview. This is where the story took another turn. Mykelti later discussed the reaction to her interview and said she had faced backlash from both family members and TLC. According to reporting on her comments, Mykelti said the network was unhappy with her recent interview and that she felt she was being watched more closely afterward.
Her and her kids cross the country tomorrow.
She said she was under a microscope. Now, let's be very careful here. There is a major difference between saying Mykelti said TLC was unhappy and claiming that TLC is conducting some secret investigation or trying to silence her. There is no verified evidence of that more extreme claim. But Mykelti's own statement is still significant because it raises a question about reality television itself. What happens when a person who grew up on a reality show decides to tell a story that doesn't fit neatly into the show's established narrative? Who owns that story? The network? The parents, the production company,
so we were trying to
or the
see
person
them in
who
St.
actually
George.
lived it?
They
For
had
Mykelti,
plans
that
that they
question
couldn't
may be becoming personal. There's another reason her recent comments matter. Mykelti is now an adult. She's married. She's a mother. She's built a life outside the original Brown family household. And she has her own platforms where she can speak directly to an audience. That changes everything. When Mykelti was a teenager appearing on Sister Wives, viewers mostly received her through the lens of a television production. Today, she can sit down for a long-form interview and explain what she remembers in her own words. There is no episode structure, no 30-minute television arc, no requirement to resolve everything before the credits. And no need to make her childhood fit into a particular storyline. She can say, this is what I remember. This is how I felt. This is what I believe happened. And viewers can decide what they think. That's powerful. But it is also risky because once a reality star opens the door to the past, the audience starts asking questions. And sometimes those questions are much bigger than the person who originally opened the door expected. One of the most explosive parts of Mykelti's recent interview involved her relationship with Meri Brown. Mykelti was extremely critical of Meri and described their relationship as deeply strained. She said she did not like Meri growing up and alleged that Meri was mean, aggressive, and manipulative toward the children. She also described being afraid of Meri's anger when Meri was supervising the children. These are serious allegations. And again, they are Mykelti's claims and memories, not findings established by a court or independent investigation. But they are important because they add another voice to a conversation that Sister Wives fans have been having for years. For a long time, viewers saw Meri's complicated relationship with the family through adult conflicts, the catfishing scandal, the marriage problems, the tension with Kody, the changing family structure. But Mykelti is talking about something different. She's talking about what she remembers as a child, and that changes the emotional context. Here's where things become complicated, because Mykelti's story doesn't simply tell us that one person was good and another person was bad. It paints a picture of a family that was complicated, crowded, religiously structured, emotionally complicated, and constantly changing. Mykelti has also acknowledged positive things about members of her family. She has spoken positively about Janelle. She has discussed Christine's importance in her life. And her feelings toward different family members have evolved over time. That matters. Because real families are rarely divided into heroes and villains, especially families as complicated as the Browns. A person can love someone and still be hurt by them. A person can remember good memories and painful memories at the same time. And a child can experience the same household very differently from another child. That is why Mykelti's perspective should be examined carefully rather than simply turned into another Sister Wives team sport. And eventually, all roads lead back to Kody because Mykelti isn't just talking about individual incidents, she's talking about the environment in which she grew up. Kody was the father at the center of this enormous family. He promoted the idea that plural marriage could create a larger support system for children. But when one of his children grows up and says that children sometimes felt overlooked, that creates an uncomfortable contradiction. Was the system actually working the way it was supposed to? Or did the sheer size of the family make certain problems easier to miss? Mykelti's comments don't answer that question for everyone, but they force viewers to ask it. And that may be one of the most important consequences of her decision to speak publicly. She's not simply changing how fans see Mykelti. She's potentially changing how fans look back at the entire Brown family structure. Perhaps one of the most unexpected aspects of Mykelti's story is the role of Robyn. Robyn entered the Brown family when Mykelti was already older, and yet, according to Mykelti's own account, Robyn became significant in the aftermath of her childhood experience. Mykelti has credited Robyn with believing her and with helping change the way the situation was handled. That is particularly interesting because Robyn has spent years being portrayed by many viewers as the person who caused division within the Brown family. But Mykelti's memories don't fit neatly into that narrative. Instead, Mykelti has described Robyn as someone who, in this particular situation, took her seriously. And that creates one of the biggest questions of all. Could the woman many fans blame for destroying the family actually have been one of the adults who made Mykelti feel heard during one of the darkest moments of her childhood? That's the kind of contradiction that makes the Brown family story so difficult to reduce to simple headlines. For years, Sister Wives viewers could argue about what they saw on television. They could analyze body language. They could debate editing. They could choose sides. But now Mykelti is saying, you didn't see everything. And that may be the real bombshell. Not necessarily one particular allegation. Not one particular parent. Not one particular marriage. But the realization that the television version of the Brown family may only represent a fraction of what the children experienced. Mykelti is offering her own perspective, and whether viewers agree with every detail or not, her willingness to talk about it is forcing the audience to reconsider the difference between watching a family and actually being raised inside that family. Because when Mykelti talks about her past, eventually one person keeps coming back into the conversation, her father, Kody Brown. For years, viewers watched Kody describe himself as the father at the center of one enormous family. He talked about loving his children. He talked about wanting them to remain close, and he repeatedly emphasized the importance of family loyalty. But today, some of his adult children have a very different relationship with him, and Mykelti's story is one of the clearest examples of how dramatically that relationship has changed. The question isn't simply whether Mykelti and Kody disagree. The real question is, what happened between them that made their relationship so different from the father-daughter bond viewers once saw on television? And there is another uncomfortable question. Did the collapse of Kody's marriages also contribute to the collapse of his relationship with his children? Because when the Brown family began falling apart, the children were no longer standing outside the conflict. They were caught in the middle. When Sister Wives first began, Mykelti was young. She was energetic, she was outspoken, and she clearly had a relationship with her father. But as the years passed, the Brown family changed. The children grew older, they moved away, they got married, they started their own families, and Kody's relationships with his wives became increasingly complicated. Then came COVID. Then came disagreements over rules. Then came tension between Kody and several of his older children. And eventually, the family structure that had once appeared permanent began collapsing one relationship at a time. Christine left Kody. Janelle separated from him. Meri eventually walked away as well. And suddenly, the man who had once been the center of a plural family was living a very different life. But the biggest consequence may not have been the end of the marriages. It may have been the growing distance between Kody and his children. One of the biggest turning points in the Brown family was the pandemic. Kody became increasingly strict about COVID precautions. His rules created enormous tension within the family. Some of his adult children did not agree with the restrictions. And viewers watched arguments unfold over who could visit, who could travel, and what behavior was considered acceptable. But from the children's perspective, there was another issue underneath all of this. Was their father choosing rules over relationships? That's a question Mykelti and several of her siblings have wrestled with in different ways. And once the family began dividing into separate groups, it became much harder for Kody to maintain the same relationship with all of his children. The Brown family had always depended on physical proximity, multiple homes, shared celebrations,
she's really sad,
family
she's definitely
gatherings,
gonna miss out on a lot of the
children
years
moving
that
between
my kids are young.
But once those connections broke down, emotional distance followed. And Mykelti was watching all of it happen. This is one of the most important parts of understanding Mykelti's perspective. She isn't looking at childhood only through the eyes of a daughter anymore. She's looking at it through the eyes of a mother. Mykelti and Tony have built their own family, and becoming parents naturally changed the way Mykelti viewed her own childhood. Suddenly, questions that might have seemed normal when she was younger could feel completely different. What should a parent do when a child says something is wrong? How seriously should a child's fear be taken? When should an adult step in? How much responsibility should older children have for younger siblings? And what happens when a child doesn't feel comfortable speaking up? These aren't abstract questions for Mykelti. They're questions connected to the way she remembers growing up. And becoming a mother may have given her a completely different perspective on the choices the adults around her made. There is something powerful about becoming a parent after growing up in a complicated family. You start comparing, you start questioning. You start noticing things you didn't have the language to describe as a child. Mykelti has talked publicly about parenting and about the importance of protecting children. And that makes her childhood revelations even more emotional because she's no longer asking
the closest thing I have is cousins for my kids, okay?
Yeah, no polygamy.
She's also asking, what would I do if this happened to my child? That is a completely different question. And sometimes becoming a parent can force people to revisit memories they thought they had already processed. Mykelti's relationship with Kody has been complicated for years.
It's just not what
she has defended him at certain moments. She has criticized him at others. And like many of the Brown children, she doesn't necessarily fit into one simple category. She's not simply Team Kody. She's not simply Team Christine. Her relationship with her father has its own history. But as the years went on, Mykelti became increasingly open about her disappointment. She has described Kody as selfish in discussions about their family relationships. And that word matters. Because when a child describes a parent as selfish, they're not usually talking about one isolated argument. They're talking about a pattern of decisions, a pattern of priorities, a pattern of feeling that someone else's needs repeatedly came before theirs. That is the emotional core of Mykelti's criticism. This is where the Brown family story becomes complicated again. For years, many fans believed Robyn was responsible for Kody's increasing distance from his older children. The argument was simple. Kody became closer to Robyn. He spent more time with Robyn's children. His relationship with his other wives deteriorated. Therefore, some viewers concluded that Robyn was the reason the family fell apart. But Mykelti's own experiences don't fit that simple explanation. As discussed in part 1, Mykelti has credited Robyn with believing her during an extremely difficult childhood situation. That doesn't erase the broader family conflicts. It doesn't mean everyone agrees about Robyn, and it doesn't mean Mykelti has given Robyn a permanent endorsement. It simply demonstrates something important. People's relationships inside this family are far more complicated than what viewers see online. Someone can be deeply hurt by a person in one situation and still remember that same person helping them in another. That is why Mykelti's perspective is so interesting. She's not giving fans the easy answer. She's giving them a complicated one. Then there's Christine. For Mykelti, Christine has always occupied a special place. Christine wasn't simply one of the adults in the family. She was Mykelti's biological mother, and after Christine left Kody, the relationship between mother and daughter continued. But Christine's departure also created another difficult reality. For years, Mykelti had been part of a family system where her parents were spiritually and emotionally connected. Then that system ended. Christine started a new life. She eventually married David Woolley. She moved forward, she found happiness, and her children watched their mother rebuild her life. For Mykelti, that may have created a contrast. One parent was moving forward, another was increasingly isolated from several adult children. And Mykelti was standing somewhere between those two worlds. One thing people sometimes forget about sister wives is that the children grew up watching the adults too. They weren't passive characters. They knew when their parents were fighting. They knew when one household was getting more attention. They knew when siblings were angry. They knew when relationships were changing. And eventually, they became adults who could compare those experiences with their own lives. That's why Kody's relationship with his children became such a major part of the show's later seasons.
Her and her kids cross country tomorrow.
The story stopped being only about plural marriage. It became about the consequences of the family structure. Who stayed close, who walked away, who forgave, who didn't, and who still wanted a relationship with Kody. Mykelti's relationship with Tony is another important part of this story. Together, they have created their own household and family, and that means Mykelti has the opportunity to make choices differently from the way she believes things were handled during her childhood. She can establish her own rules. She can decide what kind of parent she wants to be. She can determine what boundaries exist in her home, and perhaps most importantly, she can decide what parts of her past she wants to talk about. That's exactly what she's doing now. Instead of waiting for sister wives to revisit her childhood, Mykelti is discussing it directly. And that's why her recent interviews matter. She isn't waiting for the Brown family story to be told for her. She's telling her own version. Once Mykelti began speaking more openly, the reaction was immediate. Some fans supported her. Others questioned her memories. Some accused her of exaggerating. Others said that childhood experiences are subjective and that different siblings can remember the same household completely differently. And then came the reported tension with TLC. According to Mykelti's comments reported by entertainment outlets, she felt that TLC was unhappy with some of what she had discussed and that she was now under greater scrutiny. Beachley's Reality Roundup, calm. Again, we need to separate what is known from what fans are speculating. There is no verified evidence that TLC is secretly investigating Mykelti or attempting to silence her. But the fact that Mykelti says she feels watched is significant because it raises a larger question about reality television. Imagine growing up with cameras around your family. Your childhood arguments become television. Your parents' marriages become television. Your siblings' problems become television. Your family celebrations become television. Millions of strangers watch you grow up. Then years later, you become an adult and remember things differently. Who owns those memories? A television network? A production company? Your parents? Or you? Mykelti appears to be answering that question for herself. She owns her memories, and she believes she has the right to discuss them. That's why her recent interviews feel different from ordinary sister wives drama. This isn't simply, who is fighting with whom? It's, who gets to tell the story of what really happened? That's the question fans desperately want answered. Kody has not publicly addressed every detail of Mykelti's recent disclosures, and that's important. We should not invent a reaction that hasn't been verified. But the silence itself leaves room for questions. Would Kody agree with Mykelti's version? Would he dispute it? Would he say that she remembers events differently? Or will he decide that responding publicly would only make the situation worse? Because whatever Kody chooses, the conversation is already happening. And once a child becomes an adult and begins describing their childhood publicly, the parent can no longer completely control the narrative. And this is where Mykelti's story becomes much bigger than Mykelti. Because if one child remembers the family one way and another remembers it differently, which version is correct? Maybe both. That's the uncomfortable truth. Families don't create one universal childhood. They create multiple childhoods happening under the same roof. One child may remember warmth. Another remembers fear. One remembers support. Another remembers neglect. One remembers a parent as loving. Another remembers the same parent as distant. And in a family as large as the Browns, those differences can become enormous. That may explain why Brown family members can tell completely different stories about the same years. Mykelti has already opened several doors. Her childhood, her relationship with Meri, her complicated feelings about Kody, her positive memories involving Robyn, her experience growing up in a plural family, and now her concerns about how her story has been received. But there is still one major question. What does Mykelti actually want from Kody today? Does she want reconciliation? Does she want accountability? Does she simply want distance? Or does she want her father to finally understand how his decisions affected his children? Because those are very different things. And if Mykelti eventually answers that question publicly, it could become one of the most emotional moments in the entire Brown family story. For years, fans assumed the biggest sister wives story was the collapse of Kody's marriages, but maybe that was only the beginning. Because after Christine left, after Janelle separated, after Meri finally walked away, the next story became something much more personal, the children. What did they experience? What did they remember? What did they keep quiet about? And what happens when those children become adults and decide they're finally ready to speak? Mykelti has already shown us what can happen when one Brown child decides to tell her side. And if she continues, there could be even more questions about the childhood experiences of the Brown children, the rules inside the family, and the events that viewers never saw. Because the cameras may have captured the Brown family, but they didn't capture everything. And now Mykelti is filling in some of those missing pieces. But the biggest question is still waiting. What happened between Mykelti and Kody after the family began falling apart? Why did their relationship become so distant? A family that was once presented as one united household gradually became divided into separate lives. Christine moved forward. Janelle built her own path. Meri created a new chapter. And the Brown children became adults who were no longer willing to simply stand silently in the middle. For Mykelti, that transformation appears to have created one important realization. She doesn't have to wait for anyone else to tell her story. She can tell it herself. And that's exactly what makes her recent revelations so powerful. One of the biggest mistakes fans can make with the Brown family is assuming everyone has to choose a team. Kody or Christine, Meri or Janelle, Robyn or the other wives, but Mykelti's perspective is much more complicated. She can love her father and still criticize him. She can love her mother and still recognize her mother's mistakes. She can have positive memories of Robyn while disagreeing with other things that happened inside the family. She can have painful memories involving Meri without claiming that every moment of their relationship was identical. That's what makes her story feel more human. Because real family relationships aren't edited into 30-minute episodes. They're messy, they're emotional, and sometimes they're contradictory. There's another part of this story that shouldn't be overlooked. Mykelti is no longer the teenager viewers remember from the early seasons. She's a wife, she's a mother, she's built a life with Tony, and she has spent years living outside the original Brown family structure. That distance matters. Sometimes you can't understand your childhood clearly until you're far enough away from it. When you're a child, certain things simply feel normal because that's the only life you've ever known. But when you become an adult, you encounter other families, other parenting styles, other relationships, other ways of communicating, and suddenly you begin asking, was my childhood really supposed to look like that? For Mykelti, becoming an adult may have given her the perspective to ask those questions, and becoming a parent may have made those questions even more personal. Mykelti isn't only thinking about what happened to her. She's also thinking about what kind of environment she wants for her own children. That changes the stakes. A person can tolerate something for themselves and still decide they don't want their children experiencing the same thing. That's one of the strongest themes running through Mykelti's story. Breaking patterns, not necessarily because everything her parents did was wrong, not because her childhood contained no happy memories, but because she has the opportunity to decide which parts of that childhood she wants to carry forward and which parts she wants to leave behind.
My kids are young.
For years, Kody's biggest argument for plural marriage was that it created a larger family, more adults, more siblings, more support, more people to rely on. But Mykelti's reflections raise an uncomfortable question. Does having more people around automatically mean a child receives more emotional support? Not necessarily. Sometimes more people can mean more support.
Letting him have a chess career.
Responsibility becomes unclear.
I shouldn't do that.
One adult assumes another adult is handling something. An older child steps in. A younger child remains quiet. And a problem doesn't receive the attention it needs. Mykelti's story doesn't prove that this happened in every situation, but her account demonstrates why the Brown family structure deserves to be examined from the children's perspective, not only from the adult's perspective. Perhaps one of the biggest surprises in Mykelti's story is the way she has spoken about Robyn. For years, Sister Wives fans have debated whether Robyn contributed to the collapse of the family. But Mykelti has shared a different perspective about a specific period of her childhood. She has credited Robyn with believing her during an extremely difficult situation. That doesn't erase every other controversy. It doesn't settle the debate over Robyn. And it doesn't mean every member of the Brown family sees her the same way. But it does show that the real family story is more complicated than the internet version. And perhaps that's exactly what Mykelti wants people to understand. The Brown family cannot be explained with one villain and one hero. This is probably the question viewers care about most. Will Kody and Mykelti ever repair their relationship? The honest answer is, we don't know. There is no reason to pretend that reconciliation has happened if it hasn't been publicly confirmed. And there is no reason to claim that the relationship is permanently destroyed either. Families change, people grow. Sometimes years of distance create opportunities for new conversations. But reconciliation requires more than one person wanting it. It requires honesty. It requires listening. And sometimes it requires acknowledging that two people remember the same events differently. If Mykelti wants that relationship repaired, she may eventually need Kody to hear her perspective without immediately defending himself. And if Kody wants a closer relationship with his daughter, he may need to understand that being a father isn't only about remembering the good things he did. Sometimes it's also about being willing to hear about the things that hurt. This brings us back to the headline, "So TLC is watching her." That phrase is attention-grabbing, but the reality is more nuanced. Mykelti has said she felt that TLC was unhappy with aspects of her recent interview and that she felt like she was under a microscope. That is Mykelti's reported perspective. It should not be turned into a claim that TLC is secretly investigating her or trying to silence her without evidence. But there is still an interesting conflict here. Mykelti grew up on a television show. Her childhood became entertainment for millions of viewers. Now she's an adult who wants to discuss that childhood in her own words, and that creates an unavoidable tension because the network may own the footage, but Mykelti owns her memories. Those are two very different things. Whatever happens with sister wives in the future, one thing is already true. The Brown children are adults now. They can speak. They can podcast. They can write. They can give interviews. They can explain what they believe happened behind the scenes. And they don't necessarily need a television episode to give them permission. That's a major change from the early years of the show. Back then, viewers waited for Sunday night to see what happened next. Today, information can come directly from the family members themselves. And that means the traditional reality TV narrative has become much harder to control. It's tempting to focus only on the most shocking statement. That's what headlines do. But Mykelti's story is actually much larger. It's about growing up in a huge family. It's about plural marriage. It's about parenting. It's about siblings. It's about religion. It's about expectations placed on children. It's about loyalty. It's about trauma. It's about becoming an adult and looking backward. And ultimately, it's about identity. Who was Mykelti when she was growing up? Who did the family expect her to become? And who is she choosing to become now? That final question may be the most important one. The young woman fans met in the early seasons was outspoken. But today's Mykelti is speaking from a completely different position. She's no longer asking for permission. She's no longer dependent on her parents, and she's no longer simply a child inside somebody else's story. She's an adult with her own family, her own experiences, her own memories, and her own platform. That doesn't automatically make every statement she makes objectively proven. But it does mean her perspective deserves to be heard and evaluated carefully, not dismissed, not blindly accepted, heard. This is where things get really interesting because Mykelti has already opened several doors. Her childhood, her relationship with her parents, her experiences with the Brown mothers, her complicated relationship with Kody, her perspective on Robyn, her life with Tony, her role as a mother, and her concerns about how her public statements have been received. The natural question is, will she continue? Will she reveal more? Will she discuss more about the family? Will other Brown children eventually tell their own versions? And could these individual stories eventually create a much larger picture of what life inside the Brown family was actually like? Nobody can know for certain, but the possibility is exactly why fans are paying attention. Maybe this is the biggest change of all. For years, Sister Wives was primarily the story of Kody and his wives. Now, increasingly, it has become the story of the children who grew up inside that marriage system. And every child has a different perspective. One may want reconciliation. Another may want distance. One may defend a parent. Another may criticize the same parent. And somewhere between all those voices is a much more complicated picture of the Brown family. Mykelti is simply one of the children choosing to speak. And her willingness to speak could encourage other family members to explain their own experiences. So what should viewers take away from Mykelti's revelations? Not that every accusation is automatically proven.
Don't have kids yet, and they're not
Not that every member of the Brown family is guilty of everything being discussed online. And not that TLC is secretly plotting against Mykelti. The more important lesson is this. Reality television is never the entire reality. A camera can capture an argument. It can capture a conversation. It can capture a family celebration. But it cannot capture every thought inside a child's head. It cannot record every conversation that happens when the cameras are gone. And it cannot tell us exactly how every child experienced the same household. That's why Mykelti's voice matters. She's giving viewers another piece of the puzzle. Not necessarily the entire puzzle, but another piece. Perhaps after years of being introduced as someone's daughter, someone's sister, or one of Kody Brown's many children, Mykelti is finally stepping into a different identity. Mykelti, a woman, a wife, a mother, and someone who believes she has the right to tell her own story. Whether viewers agree with every detail or not, that's the real transformation. She is no longer asking, what does my family want me to say? She's asking, what do I remember? What do I believe? And what am I ready to share? And that is a very different kind of freedom. The Brown family story has changed dramatically since Sister Wives first premiered. The marriages have changed. The homes have changed. The relationships have changed. The children have grown up. And now the people who were once simply characters in their parents' story are becoming
But
storytellers
also, Tony needs
themselves.
to pursue his chess
Mykelti
career.
may
You're
not
like
be able
wife
to
of
change
the
her
century?
childhood. She can't
Letting
go
him have
back
a
and
chess
rewrite the
career?
moments that hurt.
Sorry,
she
I
can't
shouldn't do
erase
that.
the
Fancy.
complicated
So we
relationships.
were trying to see
and
them
she
in
can't
St.
control
George.
what
They had
every
plans
viewer
that they couldn't
believes.
change.
But she can control one thing, her voice. And perhaps that's why her recent revelations have struck such a nerve. Because this isn't simply another
But
sister-wives
she's really sad
argument.
because she's definitely
It's an
going to
adult
miss out
daughter
on a
looking
lot
back
of
at
the
the
years
family
that
that raised
my
her
kids
and
are young.
saying,
And we had
there's more
plans
to
that
my
we
story
couldn't
than what you
change.
saw on
But we
television.
just never
And
were
now,
able
for the
to make
first
the
time, she's
contact.
deciding exactly how much of that story she wants the world to hear. So the real question isn't whether Mykelti will become the next big sister wives controversy. The real question is what
Tony
happens
Mykelti ever
when
really
more brown
considered
children
plural
decide they're
marriage.
ready
I
to
think
tell
we
their
gave off
stories
the image
too.
that plural marriage was
Because
easy.
if Mykelti's recent revelations have taught us anything, it's that the Brown family story may be far from finished. And the cameras aren't the only place where the truth, or at least each person's version of it, is going to be told. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe because the Brown
Should we
family story
introduce her?
continues to evolve.
This is true.
And the next revelation could completely
soon to
change the
come.
way
I
fans
was
look at
overwhelmed
sister
with
wives.
everything.